Live. Setting up the meeting. Here it goes. It tells us we're live, but on my screen. But now we'll see if it really happens.
It does on mine as well. So
okay. So yeah, we're going live on Facebook. S. Jonathon O'Donnell and Phil Wyman. This is Wild Theology Podcast, and today we're going to talk about demonology and spiritual warfare. And this is Jonathon O'Donnell, who just wrote a book called Passing Orders. He's got it, and he's going to hold it up. I have only an e-copy. There it is. I found it to be an absolutely fascinating read. It was great. It's well written. Not to say that it's an easy read, because it's academic. So that's kind of the nature of the beast, right? but you write very well, and it was impressive. And so you are a demonologist?
I'm kind of a meta demonologist in a weird way. It's in that I write about other people's demonologies. So that's probably the best way to put it. But yeah, colloquially, I sometimes introduce myself as a demonologist because it gets a rise out of people.
It certainly. I mean, are you like I don't know, Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General?
Definitely not.
You're the counter.
I'm closer to the witch and the Witchfinder General in a lot of ways.
which then I suppose goes to the question of, so what is your own spirituality? Do you have one that you attach to?
Not really, actually.
Okay.
I grew up. I mean, I guess I can talk about it a bit. So I grew up in a mostly atheist, agnostic household.
Right.
Then during my late teens, I kind of moved through a variety of, I guess, new religious movements, you might call them. I flooded a bit with sort of neo-paganism, Wicca, various New Age movements, bit of Buddhism occasionally. Got slightly into modern Satanism for a while, and then gave it up because it didn't really agree with me.
Yeah. So you're talking about for people who might not know, Satanism that's not literal.
Not like child sacrifice, like that kind of thing. More like atheistic self-spirituality that grows out of a kind of 60s counterculture.
Sure. Movement. The LaVeyan Satanism.
And essentially, one of the reasons it doesn't jive is partly because of, I don't find the focus on self especially useful, personally.
Right.
Although I totally get why other people might.
But you don't have a Christian leaning in your spirituality.
I do not have a Christian leaning. I have never had a Christian leaning at any point in my life.
Okay. But you're an expert in Christian demonology.
Yeah, that's a weird circuitous path. So, although I don't really have a background in Christianity, I was raised in Christian culture, in the UK.
Church of England.
I went to a Church of England junior school, for example, so I got used to kind of singing hymns in assembly. So I was very much surrounded by the cultural trappings of Christianity, and had a kind of baseline familiarity with it. I knew there was a guy called Jesus. He was probably a good guy. That's basically the limit of what my knowledge of Christianity was at the time growing up.
Right.
I read the book of Revelation when I was about 15 or 16, and that's probably the starting point of most of the trajectory of my later development.
You got sucked in
as a scholar of apocalypticism and demonology.
It's hard. It's hard to deny that it's not good reading.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I had a very weird emotional relationship with Revelation when I read it, because although I wasn't raised as Christian, there was still a kind of background cultural sense that the Bible was in some sense true that I was raised with, at least in a kind of vague background way. So coming across Revelation at like an impressionable age and at least slightly mentally processing it as something that was supposed to happen,
Right.
like even if I didn't really believe in it, like left a very lasting impression in terms of like what is this thing? What does it do in the world?
Right. Right. And then somewhere from apocalypticism,
Yeah.
you move to more specifically demonology,
Demonology.
or transition
Yeah.
across. Right.
Yeah, I mean, like, so that came about during my doctoral research, which I conducted at the University of London from kind of 2010 to 2015.
Right.
I started researching apocalypticism, and particularly apocalyptic rhetoric and imagery in contemporary America, specifically in the kind of post 9/11 Bush years, essentially.
Right.
And then through the process of that, one of the things I realized very quickly was that scholarship was not talking about demonology in that context. Satan might get a reference, the Antichrist might get a reference occasionally, but there was no real sense of demons as a kind of multiplicity or plurality of spiritual entities that were being posited as really existent and as kind of maneuvering behind the scenes, which was the language and the imagery that I was finding in the primary source texts that I was analyzing in the what we'd call spiritual warfare manuals, or just evangelical texts more generally. So this very much seemed like an omission.
Right.
And then tying back to like my sort of childhood flirtations with like occult spirituality, neo-paganism, and New Age. Like there was always a kind of attraction to demons as imagery and as cultural symbols, like within that context.
Right.
I never tried to summon any. I should point that out. But
this is good. Matthew Hopkins would be after you.
Precisely. Yeah, or maybe I'm just saying that so Matthew Hopkins doesn't come after.
Doesn't come after you, yeah.
But no, there was this like, so I always had that kind of attraction in terms of like thinking about them as an aspect of religion, of spirituality, of like a kind of cosmology or worldview. And then that combined with the kind of scholarly omission of them very much kind of led me to kind of be like, okay, what's going on here? Like both why are these things not being discussed? They then did start to be discussed, like right towards the end of my PhD in 2015. Another book on spiritual warfare came out by a scholar named Sean McLeod called American Possessions. It's very good. But that was at that time only the second academic book on spiritual warfare on the market. Indeed, my book is the third. So
wow. So in this respect of academic demonologists, it's a small community of you guys.
Yeah, I mean,
how many?
one of the things you'll find if you look at like academic studies of demonology is it tends to focus primarily on early Christianity or Second Temple Judaism, like ancient demonology.
Sure.
Or it focuses on the early modern period. It looks at the witchcraft, the witch hunts, the Inquisition, kind of that period.
Right.
And there's very much a sense that demonology as an active part of people's religiosity, people's religion, fades away with modernity, essentially. Which it doesn't. It very much hangs around.
Right. I mean, the quote burning times are the solid evidence of that, right?
Yeah, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But that's still the witch hunt period. I'm thinking kind of later, like once you get into secularization, once you get into kind of secular modernity, there's very much this sense that demonology as an active part of religion, of Christian spirituality, just kind of fades away, which it doesn't. It might become more fringe in terms of like the mainline churches, as they push towards more kind of like rationality-centered forms of Christianity. But it very much survives as an aspect of, I guess, folk culture, or aspect of what we'd later come to think of as kind of conspiracy theory, early conspiracy theory discourse, like these ideas of groups like the Illuminati who are like using evil magic to kind of control the world from behind the scenes. Of course, this is also the era where you start getting the rise of ceremonial magic in sort of esoteric scholarship, and the rise of things
so we're
like
talking what, the late 1800s, early 1900s?
Late 1800s, 1900s.
People like Crowley and
Crowley's 20th century, but like the predecessors to Crowley. But I mean, you still have this conception of the demonic that's operating within like Western esoteric traditions that kind of grows out of its history in Christianity, but then transfers over. But there was never really a sense, at least in the West, that demonology, the sort of literal belief in demons, was very much a living part of contemporary religious practice. There was some scholarship on it in Africa or in Southeast Asia, for example, but very little focusing on it in sort of Europe or America. Even though these groups were existing primarily within the same global networks of kind of Pentecostal and charismatic Christian practice. Right. Yeah, good example, actually, just a mild tangent, is in a lot of academic scholarship that's not religious studies, like the term demonology is often just used to mean like othering or like demonization in a kind of, not in a literal sense, but in a kind of more symbolic like sense of dehumanization. There's never a sense that demonology in that context like has this religious history, or if it does, that religious history, it's still like a living part of how those systems of othering are operating today. Right.
So, and that actually, I wanted to, that leads to the question I wanted to ask you. When you talk about demons, you're looking at it from this non-religious academic perspective, a sociological perspective, perhaps, an anthropological perspective. So what do you mean by the terminology demon? What is conjured in your head with that word?
That's kind of that's a difficult question, actually. Within popular culture and I think general public discourse, the term demon generally just refers to like an evil spirit. It's often applied cross-culturally. It's often just used to mean malevolent spiritual entity, and like that is very much an element of the kind of Christian spiritual warfare discourses that I'm talking about. But within Christianity specifically, demon has a much more specific connotation in that its image of evil or malevolence is figured as specifically in rebellion against God specifically, but like the idea of kind of God as sovereign ruler of the universe. There's this very specific sense of rebellion, of kind of willful deviation from the kind of proper order of the cosmos, that is present within Christianity and is present within the figure and the kind of history of the demon as a kind of spiritual entity, but is not necessarily translatable in a cross-cultural context. Like, you may find an evil spirit in another culture, and you may, for the purposes of translation and legibility, call it a demon, but that doesn't mean that it has that specific relationship to power and to divine power that it does within Christianity.
Yeah, I had some interesting contextual struggles talking about American neo-paganism and witchcraft in seminary classes with a mix of American and African students. They were studying for their master's in theology at Gordon Conwell, and when I said the word witch, the Nigerian or other African heard one thing, and the American heard another, and to the American, the witch was an individual who practiced this neo-pagan spirituality that then could be understood in the light of its rituals and its lifestyle and who they were as individuals. In the African mind, the word witch was the spirit that inhabited an individual who practiced witchcraft. And so when I said that, and so we're going to get to learn who these witches are, one person said, this should be interesting. And the other person was thinking, how can we do this? Right?
Yeah. I mean, like, I'm not an expert in Nigerian Pentecostalism specifically. There are other people who can much more closely speak to that, other scholars. But like it is, like that, there is that very strong conception of witchcraft within Nigerian society that then feeds into the Pentecostal practice of spiritual warfare. And there are several articles written on this context that are very different from the American context. But I will also add there that I don't think necessarily the conceptions of witchcraft in that Nigerian Pentecostal context versus the way that witchcraft is discussed within spiritual warfare are actually that different, like in America.
I think you're right.
I think there tends to be a subsumption of like conceptions of Wicca, for example, like as an individual pagan practice, into that like more like amorphous conception of witchcraft. One of the things that I think really comes across with this, and something I talk about in the book, is the way that within a lot of spiritual warfare texts, witchcraft is not really something you do. It's something that's kind of channeled through you. It's like an energy that exists in the world. That's kind of emitted by demons in this context. Like there's the sense that like the presence of demons kind of produces witchcraft almost as a kind of energy that then like the surrounding culture kind of taps into and harnesses.
So the individual becomes a channel for a malevolent force against individuals and society as a whole.
Yeah, but it's also worth pointing out that like what is malevolent in this context, and that kind of comes back to the discourse of rebellion, because essentially and often within these frameworks, rebellion is just used to mean anything that disagrees with that individual or group's particular conception of what proper Christianity is. So it can include everything from Wiccans to Voodoo to Catholics to Muslims to whoever it happens to be.
Sure, taking us back to an Old Testament verse, rebellion is as the spirit of witchcraft.
The sin of witchcraft, which is quoted frequently in these texts. But a good example of this would be there's one text that I talk about in the book where the author is on mission she just refers to it as like a Muslim country where Christianity is forbidden or underground. It's never named. There's no like.
Right. I know a number of people in those circles, and they have to be that way because they could get arrested.
Yeah.
So sometimes that's the case.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not blaming her for not mentioning the country, but so there's this moment where she talks about being in her apartment, and then suddenly she gets kind of hit by this wave of fatigue, basically, and this kind of like the shock wave has kind of struck her. And then later, when she's trying to figure out what happened, she finds out that it was Friday, and that's when Muslims have their Friday prayers. And then so she contextualizes the Islamic Friday prayer like in this language of witchcraft, that she was kind of struck by this kind of wave of witchcraft. But of course, the thing is like that is a collectional devotional action. Like that is a form of community. That is a form of social building. And similarly, other authors will talk about, say, Catholics celebrating Lent, for example, or other festivals as a form of witchcraft, or Wiccans doing collective group rituals during Halloween, for example.
Right.
These are forms of community building, but they are forms of community building that are alien or othered to the form that the evangelical or Pentecostal writer is kind of trying to formulate.
Sure.
So there's the sense that witchcraft isn't necessarily against society, but it's against the very specific image of society that they want to put forward and build.
So in that sense, it's that demonic activity flowing through another in the spirit of witchcraft is malevolent to my world. as the evangelical, right?
Malevolent
right.
to the world,
or at least as the spiritual warrior.
To the spiritual warrior.
I don't want to buttonhole all evangelicalism into that one.
And it's worth pointing out that there are a lot of evangelicals that do not believe in spiritual warfare.
Right.
However, it is growing within evangelical circles broadly.
Yeah. So that brings me to a question of, you mentioned that spiritual warfare through the history of Christianity had times when it rose into popular prominence and then would disappear into fringe factors, almost go underground and rise again. So in terms of American spiritual warfare and its integration in politics, where does that rise to prominence that has brought us to these interesting times we've been in, the last 5 years, particularly with Trump prophecies and calling for angels from Africa with Paula White and, the interesting things that occur.
So it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you could argue that in some ways this has been an element since the kind of post-World War II revival periods in terms of its integration with politics. Because you have like the revivalist preachers like Billy Graham, for example, on his kind of tours. And although he's not necessarily practicing this what we think of today as this kind of more developed spiritual warfare, like he's touching on a lot of the same points about like fighting against secular society, fighting against kind of
he becomes very political.
Of American that a lot of contemporary spiritual warfare practice draws on. They draw on that kind of legacy. So in a lot of ways, it's been a growing element since the rise of the Christian right and the religious right more broadly in America, and it's always kind of been there as an element of it.
Sure.
We
saw it with Billy Sunday and Amy Semple McPherson, and we're talking
even earlier.
We're talking around World War I at that time.
Which I guess is this question sort of then is what do you mean by politics? Because obviously, these movements have always been political and have always had an influence on the kind of political positions and the culture around them. So there's the sense, do you mean politics in the sense of, I guess, high politics in terms of people getting into government, people getting into legislature, or do you mean kind of politics in a more popular sense? In which case, it's always been political in that sense. But if you mean has it always been political in a kind of capital P, government legislative sense, that's more recent. That kind of comes with the Christian. It comes with the Christian right, but it especially comes, I think it comes partly in the post-Cold War era, because there's a surge in spiritual warfare that happens during the latter half of the Cold War, very much tying into anti-communist sentiment and things like that.
Jerry Falwell and the moral majority.
Jerry Falwell. Pat Robertson, that whole trajectory. And then you get the fall of the Soviet Union, you get the unipolar moment, the kind of rise of American global dominance. And that permits this kind of building what is sometimes referred to as third wave spiritual warfare movement that kind of grows up.
Peter Wagner's terminology.
Peter Wagner's kind of group with its idea of territorial spirits and spiritual mapping. To then kind of map on their practice onto this globalization of American power. So they start sending missionaries to the Soviet Union. They start pushing for the 1040 window, the kind of Christianization of the Middle East and of East Asia and things like that. That very much kind of maps onto this post-Cold War globalization of American authority. You get the War on Terror and the rise of the evangelical lobby within the Bush like in
Right.
Bush's administration.
Sure.
But in a lot of ways, although Bush definitely did deploy the language of cosmic warfare in his speeches and in his kind of rhetoric, and definitely in the
Right.
general culture, I'd say the more specifically spiritual warfare Pentecostal aspect doesn't really start to kick off until post Bush era. You have Sarah Palin, for example. It's very
Okay.
much who's part
Right.
of the
Right.
Assemblies of God. You have the Tea Party movement more broadly, which has a lot of overlap, both in individuals but also in structure, because this is also the era of the kind of post-denominational network of charismatic churches,
Right.
the non-denominational movement.
Independent
so
network charismatics. Yeah.
the independent network charismatics. And so you have this general movement on the right, like both within the churches, but also more broadly towards these more kind of slightly decentralized networks of individual political actors that are kind of united loosely through, I guess, ideological or conceptual principles.
Right.
That are technically not aligned in a formal structure. They're not an organization per se, but they're kind of moving in the same circles. They're reading each other's books.
Right.
They're
Right. Right.
networking similar events, so like conferences and fundraisers and things like that. And then that movement then paves the way for the Trump era, because that grows throughout
Right.
the Obama administration and the Obama years. And then you get Trump turns up, you get this shift within, sort of driven, like led in large part by people like Paula White, who already
Right.
had existent relationships with Trump, who then kind of helps to get a lot of the broader kind of evangelical Pentecostal sphere kind of on board
Right.
behind kind of Trump's presidential candidacy. Which then leads into the rise of specific, I guess, prophetic Pentecostal discourse about Trump himself. So you get Mark Taylor's The Trump Prophecies,
Right.
which then gets turned into the movie by Liberty University.
I haven't seen that. I suppose
It's
I should.
I don't know if I should advise you to watch it, but like last time I checked, it was on Amazon Prime. So
Okay.
but like actually, I mean, so just to talk briefly about that movie, actually, because I think it's a really interesting case study.
Right.
So the movie is quasi-autobiographical. It's based on the sort of biographical details in the first part of the book, The Trump Prophecies, which is written by a kind of ex-firefighter named Mark Taylor. And it basically, most of the movie, the first 2/3 of the movie, is an adaptation of the first part of that book. So it basically chronicles his being sort of having to quit work with PTSD, the visions that he starts having,
Okay.
and then he starts having vision. He starts being given prophecies that Trump is going to be president, and it kind of spirals out from there.
Okay.
The last third of the movie is a bunch of interviews with Pentecostal and charismatic preachers, like Lance Wallnau, for example,
Okay.
about like how Trump has been chosen and is going to be this amazing president.
Right.
So the movie is this really weird combination of kind of a biopic and then a propaganda film, like kind of in the same run, and being produced by Liberty, which in a lot of ways had been more like traditionally evangelical in a lot of respects.
That's typically a non-Pentecostal setting.
Yeah, precisely. So the Trump prophecy, like as a media product, represented this really interesting fusion of this kind of more old school non-Pentecostal evangelical institution like Liberty, and the kind of more Pentecostal charismatic aspect of kind of people like Wallnau, the Seven Mountains Mandate group, like
right.
Yeah, all of that. Additionally, and this is not directly related to the movie, but the book was published by a small evangelical press based out of Missouri called Defender, who generally specialize in more conspiratorial literature, evangelically slanted conspiratorial literature, but like they will be talking about like science conspiracies, ufology, the Nephilim, things that you might associate more with things like ancient aliens, but through a kind of Christian spiritual warfare lens. So although that actually isn't in the movie, there's that element within the kind of production of the product itself. So the movie is this really interesting fusion of like all of these, I guess, like subcultures or aspects that exist within the conservative evangelical sphere that all kind of came together in the Trump era.
So as you were watching this stuff unfold, you're studying it, you're writing this book, you're watching it unfold in front of you dramatically during the Trump years, right? So
yeah, you can say that again.
I mean, you couldn't have picked a better time to write it and then watch it just roll out, and you probably couldn't even keep up with all the information. So to what degree did that, you're mentioning now this, the movie, the book being published by conspiratorial press, and this integration of Liberty University, which is non-Pentecostal, fundamentalist Baptist, now putting out the movie. And so you're having this merging of these groups that don't normally fit together, and concurrently some merging of, there's not only the Pentecostal, non-Pentecostal merging with one another under the Trump umbrella, but there's also a merging of things conspiratorial like QAnon, with these same people. To what degree were you watching that happen? And did you think, wow, I've really got a bomb here?
Yeah. Well, like, in some ways, I regret not writing about Q a bit more, because I don't talk about Q in the book. Like, for anyone who wants to buy the book to read about Q, like, don't. It's not in there.
It's not in there.
Buy the book anyway. But, like, but I think
shadows
the book,
of it, in a sense.
The other thing is, I think in a lot of ways, the book will help you understand where Q came from, even though it won't tell you about Q itself.
I agree.
And I think where Q came from is itself, like, more of the story. Like, one of the issues with studying something like Q is it had a lot of moving parts. It changed quite frequently. There were common threads that ran through it, like it's the centrality of Trump to its kind of eschatological imaginary, for example. Like
the world was always going to end or rise.
But that's the interesting thing about, like, I'll touch about that in a minute, actually. But, like, it also had the language of spiritual warfare ran through a lot of Q. There was this sense of kind of the great struggle of good against evil, like, with evil being very literally conceptualized, like, in kind of demonic, satanic terms. It relied on the language of the Great Awakening, as you know, like, is a, kind of a hallmark of the history of Christianity in America, or at least the history of Protestant and evangelicalism. But also with the Great Awakening in that context, it was an interesting blend of this more kind of evangelical language of religious revival, the idea of the awakening as religious revival, but also of awakening in the more conspiratorial sense of kind of awakening to the truth, like seeing through the conspiracy, like seeing like the world as it really was. And both those kind of valences or those meanings very much combined within the kind of Q ecosystem, I guess you might call it. But like, one of the things with studying Q is that while there were these commonalities, this shared language, these sort of, I guess, goals and terms that came through it, there was also a lot of, I hesitate to call it fluff, but a lot of variation. Who was Q? Like, for some people, he was JFK Jr., who'd faked his own death. He was Trump. He was a time traveler. He was Trump and a time traveler and JFK Jr. probably. Okay, I don't know if that bit was true. But but basically, like, the idea, who people thought Q was, like, changed not just by the week, but by the individual who was engaged with it. And I think there was this very not tendency, but there was this danger when people studying Q of like getting sucked into it, of like following the rabbit hole too deep, trying to figure out exactly what was going on, rather than kind of stepping back and looking at the big picture.
And isn't that the isn't simultaneously, isn't that both the draw and the danger?
Yeah.
That
I mean,
I give you a hint and
Yeah.
you chase it, and it's, I mean, we might as well be playing D&D.
I mean, I personally think Q has a lot in common with alternate reality games, or ARGs, that have kind of cropped up through the internet.
Right.
I think it very much functioned like one. I think that was a large part of why it appealed to people.
Sure.
Like, at least initially, like, I think that's what drew a lot of people in, especially given the way it rose to prominence on places like 4chan, for example, like on these anonymous internet forums where things like ARGs were very, very prevalent and very kind of not well regarded, but like well engaged with. And I think that had a lot to do with like why it took off in the early days. Like,
then on January 6th, that, you know, we started LARPing when Q Shaman shows up at the White House, at the Congress,
but like, and that, of course, like that in a lot of ways that kind of puts into context like the bigger picture. Like, that's kind of where Q, like, the individual claims that Q made like along the way were almost irrelevant, like, because they shifted with the winds and with kind of political expediency. But something like January the 6th was where it was going to lead. Like, that was the bigger picture. Like, that narrative of deception, of authoritarian triumph, of the kind of because this is the other thing, is like Q is very apocalyptic, but it was very like secularly apocalyptic in a lot of ways. It was a last judgment, but a last judgment in very secular terms. It was Trump like locking up or executing like all of the bad people, all of the people that Q said were bad. It was this very kind of carceral American justice system like conception of a last judgment in very secular terms. There was never this sense that like, and this is one of those interesting things, because people have pointed out, for example, that a lot of the rioters who were, you know, drawn by Q on the people who attempted the coup on January 6th. When people talk about the apocalyptic aspects of that, people talk about, I've seen some comments about how, unlike with some apocalyptic movements who have a kind of doomsday event coming up, they didn't say sell all of their stuff, for example, which is very common. Because you see this with, you know, some doomsday groups, apocalyptic groups. They'll be the kind of rapture coming, and everybody will kind of sell everything they own. They'll give up their property, they'll give up their possessions, and then they'll go to the event, and the event will not happen, and then they'll be left with nothing. People have pointed out that like nobody really who was involved in January the 6th like did that, and that's because the apocalypse was never a kind of spiritual or supernatural apocalypse. It was always an apocalypse that at the end they'd go back home, basically. There was never this sense of like them going somewhere else. Like, they'd go, there would be this kind of huge event where like the wicked would be punished and the good and the righteous would be justified, and then they'd all get to go on their planes back home and like carry on as life as usual, but in a kind of imagination of a kind of purified America where like evil had been defeated. But it was fundamentally a continuation like of the material world. Like, it wasn't something more.
So I, you know, quite a bit of that is based upon the eschatology of the independent network charismatics. You know, because we've moved from a devastating eschatology in which the world ends and then Christ comes and sets up his kingdom while he protects his own, you know, while the world is being judged, to a new eschatology. Well, it's not new. It's an old eschatology of Christians rising in righteousness, creating a righteous world, and ushering in the kingdom of God. So now you don't sell your stuff, you collect more stuff.
Which I guess, like,
because your kingdom's coming, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It ties into the kind of the general kind of survivalist culture.
Yeah. Now, is that a unique switch in the combination of demonology and eschatology as we typically see it through history?
I mean, not really, because so if you look at, say, early Christianity, for example, when the church is first rising and it's kind of attempting Christianization, like this is kind of pre-Constantine, like pre like the conversion of the Roman Empire.
Right.
There's this sense of Christians as embattled by demonic forces, both kind of in the wilderness, but also in the cities.
Anthony in the desert, and
but a really good book on this actually is Dana Collares' book City of Demons.
City of Demons.
It's an academic book, came out with, I think, University of California Press a couple of years back, maybe 2017, 2016. But it's essentially a book about sort of 4th century Christian urban conversion narratives, essentially.
Right.
But in the context of spiritual warfare. So it's about the way that these kind of 4th century Christians, or late 3rd and early 4th century Christians, understood themselves as like going into pagan cities, like spiritually or sometimes physically, like overthrowing the kind of demonized deities that were kind of seen as ruling there.
The Massalian prayer movement, groups like that,
and taking the city like for God, like converting it.
Right.
In a way that you see very literally being repeated, like in contemporary spiritual warfare movements. Like, the language is different, like the framing is different. Good example of this would be in that early discourse, like one of the key ways that spiritual warfare was waged was through like the relics of saints, for example. Like people would carry the relics of saints into spaces, and that would give a kind of holy power that would help them purify the area. Like you don't get that in contemporary spiritual warfare because mostly, I mean, you might in Catholic spiritual warfare circles.
Right.
But I'm not an expert in Catholicism, so I'm not.
Right.
Within the Pentecostal stuff, because it's mostly Protestant, you don't get that. Instead, I think in America
we're iconoclasts in evangelicalism.
Well, I actually think it's kind of interesting because I think within America, especially, like the relic that you kind of the relic in inverted commas that you take is almost yourself, and it's kind of ties into the way that spiritual warfare operates through. It's kind of overlaps with self-help culture, for example, and like the way that when you read a spiritual warfare manual, it's in a lot of ways indistinguishable from like wider self-help literature that you might pick up, but with a more supernatural angle, with the idea that it's because of demonic oppression and you need to kind of dedicate your life to God to kind of overcome it. But there's this very strong sense of kind of tempering. You kind of temper yourself through these processes of kind of self-making, like into the weapon that can be used to purify these spaces.
Sure. So because I embody the person of Christ and carry a certain gift that he gives to me, I walk out as the iconographic
in a lot of
power.
Sense. Like and I think that's due specifically, like not just to the. I think that's due specifically, like, or maybe not in large part, but I think the way it manifests is tied heavily to kind of American self-help culture, the rise of the positive thinking movement, that kind of trajectory in American public and political life.
That's a really interesting observation. So John Moorhead has a question here. He jumped in just a bit ago, and he's asking, will the eschatological imaginary continue to unite this diverse coalition of Pentecostals, evangelicals, and even Orthodox Mormons and pagans in a post-Trump context?
I mean, probably. So that's actually going to be kind of an interesting potential shift. I can't give a definitive answer for that, basically. But one of the ways that the eschatology not shifted during the Trump era, but was manifested in the Trump era, was through this language of victory, because of the way that Trump emerged as this figurehead of this kind of movement. as a kind of already a figurehead. Figurehead implies that he was leading it, but like he kind of wasn't. He was. I mean, I hesitate to call him an idol, but like, you know,
Right.
he was being invested with spiritual power, like as part of this.
Sure. And we were winners.
Yeah, that was the thing. You know, there would be so much winning, you would get tired of winning. But like, but this kind of fits historical patterns of eschatology. When Christianity has conceptualized itself as dominant, such as, you know, after the conversion of the Roman Empire, for example, you had a kind of switch from a kind of what you might think of as today as a kind of premillennialist to a postmillennialist kind of eschatology. A sense that like the kingdom of God had kind of arrived, and it was our job to kind of build it in this kind of progressive process, as opposed to everything being terrible and needing a kind of divine intervention from outside. So whether in the post-Trump era you'll get this kind of switch back to a kind of more premillennialist eschatological like conception where the world is processed as being in a state of kind of degeneration and needing immediate surgery or rescue, like that would fit a historical pattern of the way eschatology works. On the other hand, it's possible that the movement that's being built will kind of continue on, like continue pushing a kind of more post-millennial a more like building the kingdom mentality.
Right.
But it's hard to say. And I think it's also worth pointing out that like in a lot of the texts, the dividing line, a lot of spiritual warfare texts, the dividing line between these eschatologies is often a lot more blurry than typologies often like to admit. For example, like you will have texts that focus on building the kingdom of God in the here and now, like on this kind of push back of the kind of demonic territories, this kind of conquest of space, that will also sit alongside a strong belief in the rapture, for example, a strong belief in the imminence of Jesus's return. So like I think it's not necessarily that there's like eschatological dissonance or cognitive dissonance. I think it's more that like on the ground, like within, like outside of a kind of theological framework, like these beliefs often actually exist simultaneously within a lot of people.
So American evangelical spirituality is becoming excessively eclectic.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it always has been. I think, especially when you're dealing with like evangelicalism as it existed kind of in society, as opposed to say in the seminaries or in theological discussions. So
let's kind of shift from that to something we were talking about just before we went on, and you talked about spiritual warfare as boundary maintenance. Could you describe that? Yeah.
So this kind of ties back to the discussion with witchcraft that we were having earlier, and the sense of witchcraft as marking non-evangelical communities within this context, and the forms of kind of collective being together of non-evangelical communities, because often in these texts, and this is both subtext but also text a lot of the time, the boundaries between spiritual warfare practice or prayer, like militant forms of prayer, and witchcraft is incredibly blurry. And often the line is specifically like prayer is aligned with the will of God and witchcraft is not. It's aligned usually with the will of the self, like within these discourses. So you'll have like prominent, you'll have people like, a good example of this would be someone like Cindy Jacobs, for example. In one of Cindy Jacobs's books, she talks about lapsing into witchcraft because she started praying for something that was not God's intention for her, basically. God had intended something for her. She didn't know this, and she was praying for something else. And then she categorized that as witchcraft, for example. So there is this sense in which the boundaries between what is prayer and what is witchcraft, and thus what is spiritual warfare and what is sorcery or what is magic within this context, are actually very porous. And
Right.
in terms of actual practice, in terms of like what they look like, they're often identical. It's just whether they are conceptualized as aligning with a particular image of kind of divine will, of like
Right.
of God's will in this context. But this kind of filters through to a lot of like the forms of boundary maintenance, this need to kind of maintain boundaries around legitimate versus illegitimate charismatic practice. That
Right.
you see this a lot. One of the things I talk about, for example, I talk about witchcraft in the chapter on Jezebel in my book, and like Jezebel is often very much a figure that's used to conceptualize this maintenance of boundaries.
Right.
So it's often particularly in terms of authority, like who has legitimate authority, like whose claims to authority are legitimate. Illegitimate people who with illegitimate authority or people who are seen as abusing their authority become cast as
Right.
kind of Jezebel figures. Jezebel being very closely aligned with witchcraft
Right.
throughout the kind of Pentecostal mindset. Not mindset, like imaginary, I guess.
Right.
So you have this very much this need to police legitimate practice, legitimate conceptions of selfhood, legitimate forms of action in a way that is often fairly indistinguishable from illegitimate forms. It's just how do they align, or how they conceived as aligning. Because of course, you know, whether something, I mean, how do you determine the will of God in this context? Like in a direct way.
Right.
And I mean, if you're a Pentecostal, you might say that God spoke to you and like told you his will. But obviously if you're non-Pentecostal, you don't believe in kind of divine prophecy in the present, that's not really going to fly with you
Right.
as a form of process of legitimization or legitimation, I guess.
Right.
So yeah.
So then terms like Jezebel become a boundary marker for a, I was going to say a leader, but it's not necessarily a leader, because I've seen people use the term Jezebel spirit about leaders they think that are out of control, and then leaders use it about the same person, saying, you know, well, they're just trying to
use it against congregant members who are maybe
a
bit unruly, a bit willful,
or looking for a position of power within the congregational structure.
But looking for a position of power that the leader has determined they do not deserve.
Right.
Or they do not merit for whatever reason. And of course, here you get into like institutional politicking and like, you know, who is being marked as a Jezebel and for what purpose. And I think it's worth pointing out that Jezebel is an incredibly gendered figure, but also an incredibly racialized figure, like within America. Like the Jezebel has a very specific history as a kind of demonizing stereotype of Black women, for example, particularly Black women as hypersexual. And it's worth noting that history tends to be completely occluded within Pentecostal discourse about Jezebel. Even within a lot of like Black Pentecostal preachers that I've read, and I haven't read widely in this context, but there's this kind of de-racialization of the figure, like as a more general figure of illegitimate authority or of kind of willful deviance. But it carries that history still. It carries that history of like whose bodies are out of place, who is being seen as seeking a place that God has not granted them. Because that's often, of course, the way that it's framed. It's framed, if someone has a Jezebel spirit or someone is being framed as having a Jezebel spirit, it's because they are seeking a place that in the mind of the demonologist, I guess in this context, like God has not granted that person. But what are the boundaries in which that are determined? And like, what are the embodied histories and the cultural histories of who is ordinarily framed as seeking places that the society's decided they do not merit or they do not like warrant within this context.
Yeah.
Um,
So this this Jezebel spirit then becomes a radical. It becomes a framing in which to place, whether it's somebody that I feel challenged by. It frames the person as a radical other,
yeah,
right? And obviously not one of us.
not one of us, one of them.
Right.
They can, like, because this is also the aspect of spiritual warfare, like, is the way that the person could conceptually give up a Jezebel spirit and therefore kind of return to the fold. But like,
Right.
what does that return look like? Like, and I mean, particularly when you're like thinking about the politicking of, like, you know, if someone raises a grievance with a church leader and they're accused of having a Jezebel spirit, even yes, conceptually they could give up that grievance and kind of show that they've, you know, been liberated from the Jezebel spirit that was controlling them. But what if that grievance was legitimate? Like, what if it was a legitimate critique of the institution? What if it was a legitimate critique of power?
I've seen a few of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly so. But yeah, it's one of those things where, like, Jezebel is a really good example of this, because Jezebel very much encapsulates the way that figures of the demonic are used by mechanisms of power, essentially.
Okay.
As ways of maintaining institutional power, as ways of maintaining authority over, say, a congregation or a group of people.
Right.
Through these accusations of willfulness, of deviation, of having an unruly spirit, of being in a rebellion, which is as the sin of witchcraft. Which is why Jezebel and witchcraft are often very, very closely combined.
So the statement of making a statement about a Jezebel spirit about another person is a type of colonial activity in a way.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Also, no.
I'm going to set up my little kingdom, and you're not going to come across my border unless you
very much
maintain.
Yeah. Which ties into the way that I think it's important, and this is something I talk about quite extensively in the book, is the way that spiritual warfare, like, operates, I guess, as a colonial technology, as a colonial enterprise. Partly, like, this is historic, like, in early colonization discourses in America, for example, like, the settlers' battles against Native Americans was framed through the language of spiritual warfare by kind of casting, like, I mean, the devil always waits for you in the wilderness, you know, like.
Right.
But yeah, so there's this very strong sense of the construction of indigenous beliefs, of indigenous practices, as diabolic, as devil worship, and this kind of filters through not just in like Native American kind of American colonization, but in Central and South America, through the Spanish colonization, in other places around the world as well.
Right.
Like any place that kind of, I guess, a kind of white Christian European colonial endeavor was going on, you had this kind of diabolization of the traditions that were encountered. But Jezebel is really interesting in that, because she very much represents, I think, perhaps more than any other demon, the kind of the fragmentation of what are considered to be proper boundaries around objects. I think this is something that demons in general in spiritual warfare represent. I think they all represent the kind of fragmentation of boundaries, and this is something that some, scholars of evangelicalism kind of pointed out in terms of the demonic. But I think Jezebel specifically is often called upon to represent the breakdown of correct boundaries, with correct in scare quotes here.
Right. Correct according to the leader or the community or whatever.
But I mean, the thing is, this kind of breakdown of boundaries is conceptualized pretty broadly. Like, it can be anything from, say, like drug addiction, like the addiction of the body on a substance that is kind of outside of it, It can be globalization, the breakdown of national boundaries. It can be the breakdown of kind of familial authority, or like a kind of image of the proper kind of patriarchal family, like this challenging of a kind of normative family structure. It can be trying to think of other, like, yeah, so like, but it can also be like abusive relationship dynamics. Like Jezebel is often sometimes framed through that lens as well, this kind of sort of toxic interpersonal dependency. So Jezebel is used to kind of conceptualize this fragmentation of what are considered to be the kind of the proper boundaries between bodies, between nations, between objects. The problem that this comes to, at least for me, is when this then becomes the broader conceptualization through which things like LGBT rights, for example, become formulated and start guiding policy in terms of like, we have determined that this relationship that you have with this other human being is illegitimate and is a breakdown of the natural order. It's Jezebelian. It's processed through this kind of breakdown of the kind of the proper boundaries between men and women, between, you know, the family or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. So, you know, so in talking about that Jezebel spirit in that way, it seems that there's much in the same way that there are a lot of, within Christianity, you have all kinds of frameworks about God, and you know, you've got very orthodox ones, and then you have, you know,
very non-orthodox ones.
and those who would try and frame it by reading scripture, and others who would frame it by experience. And so you almost have this, as it's been described, we're making God in our own image. But it seems that the Jezebel spirit is a similar thing. It's being created in the image, in an image that a person needs for the moment to be a weapon.
Yeah.
I mean, weaponizing Jezebel to
I think,
you know, drive you away.
One of the things I talk about in the book is the way that, I mean, I think to an extent, like when you're talking about demonology, like, I mean, you can argue whether or not demons like are metaphysically existent, like as entities, but when you're talking about demonology as like a social discourse, like demonology is always created by people for specific purposes at specific times, and it changes with the times. It changes, you know, the demonologies of the early modern period are not the same as the demonologies of today. Often the demonologies of today have no idea about the early modern demonologies. Sometimes they are. You'll get like occasional references to them, but generally they're completely separate. Completely separate discourses emerging from distinct historical contexts in response to distinct social crises, I guess you might frame it.
Right. So you mentioned that, we're getting to closing time here, but I don't want to miss a thought that you had said just before I asked that last question. You mentioned the LGBTQ issues and its reference to the Jezebel spirit and demonology, and I think that's just one example I know you could give, but to what degree do you see American spiritual warriors creating problems for American culture in general?
I mean, in a lot of ways. So spiritual warfare is at its heart, I think, it relies on a strong conception of what is normal and what should be normal, I think, rather than what is normal. It relies on a very strong image of what America should be, which is generally patriarchal, very straight, heterosexual, cis heteronormative, Christian, but specifically kind of white Christianity. And I don't mean this just in the sense of like white people being Christian, but a form of Christianity that emerges specifically from the history of kind of white America and kind of white European Christianity kind of.
Sure. Yeah.
but ultimately it has a very specific sense of what a kind of normative vision of America should be. And it attempts to realize that vision through spiritual warfare as a technique, through which spiritual warriors attempt to realize their vision of what America should be. And ultimately, that vision of America is pretty exclusionary. It excludes frequently LGBT people. It also excludes non-Christians, whether most notably today that would be Muslims. But also it includes, it would include other religious and ethnic minorities as well. So it's essentially, and this is I think why it overlaps so heavily with the politics of the Trump era, because Trumpism at its core was similarly a project to try and remake America in the image of a very specific conception of what is normative and what is normal, like along the lines of a particularly narrow vision of kind of white Christian America. Right.
Yeah. So,
and yeah,
was there ever
problems?
Oh, say that again. I'm sorry.
So yes, it causes problems.
Yeah. So in your study of demonology and some of the spiritual warfare down through history, is there ever a point where somebody actually stepped into a place as some kind of spiritual warfare practitioner who also embodied inclusivity and an invitation to others, to people, because there is that terminology that we utilize in Pentecostal circles, that we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and power, and so ideally there's inclusion, right?
Yeah, but this is the thing. I mean, so there may have been a person like that. I don't know.
Maybe Jesus.
I've never met them. Maybe Jesus. No, but even it depends.
He wasn't very good to the Pharisees.
I mean, but that's fair. Like, I wouldn't be very nice to the Pharisees either, to be honest.
Right. Exclude the excluder.
I think this kind of there's a kind of fundamental issue that I think often is at the heart of that kind of Pentecostal adage of struggling not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers.
Right.
And I think you see this a lot when you look at the way that demonology is used to demonize, both literally and figuratively, the LGBTQ community or Muslims, for example.
Right.
Because essentially what spiritual warfare does is it posits being gay or being lesbian or being trans or being Muslim as a result of principalities and powers. And you might not be fighting like the people, but you're fighting what makes those people who they are. Right. Because you've decided that what makes them what they are is wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you can't say you love Muslims when you're trying to stop them being Muslim.
Right.
Like, you don't love them as Muslims. You don't care for them as Muslims. You don't care for them as your neighbor. You care for them like as a potential target for conversion, in a way that ignores and denies their full humanity.
At the very least, intellectual and emotional violence.
Yeah, and epistemic violence, like the violence of spiritual violence, the violence against their way of being in the world. Right. Ontological violence.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna close on that little note, and I want to say that I really think that we as Christians and those of us who have a view of the world that it includes things flying around in the air that we can't see, and an invisible God. We need to take these. I think we need to take your critiques really seriously. Because they clearly have an impact upon culture and society. And so show us your book again, Jonathan. So this is it, Passing Orders.
Passing Orders, Demonology and Sovereignty in American Spiritual Warfare.
Yeah. So
available for the price of $30 from
Yep.
Possibly cheaper if you can.
I've got my e-copy of it, and I've read the whole thing, and I got to say it's a well-written book, and it's a great and necessary critique for what's going on in American evangelicalism, and particularly, the charismatic Pentecostal movement. So you're one smart guy, and I really like dialoguing with you.
Thank you.
This is
You
fantastic
flatter
stuff.
me. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And so this has been Wild Theology, and that's Jonathon O'Donnell and his book Passing Orders. And if this has been interesting to you, you want to read it. This will take you deeper into some of these thoughts. So anyway, thank you so much. You rock.
Thank you.